Hello, I'm Hal Varian. I'm the chief economist here at Google, and it's my great pleasure to introduce David Wessel. We were just talking that a year ago, maybe a little more than a year ago, the end of July 2008, he was visiting Google, and we're talking about what are your next plans. He says, I'm going to take a six-month sabbatical and write a book about Bear Stearns. And he says it would be kind of a nice way to get some inside information on Wall Street and describe the past and how we've averted a catastrophe. Well, little did he know that this was, in fact, a very good time to take the sabbatical because he was in the midst of battle and could write about what was going on in a very timely way. The result has been this book, In Fed We Trust, which is being offered over there at a discounted price. So David is going to give us a quick synopsis of the book, and he'll also have some time to answer questions from the audience. David.
Well, thank you very much. Hal's absolutely right. I was the idiot who decided to try and write a book about the Great Depression in 1931. But it turned into a book about predicting the present, and I'm taking credit for that phrase, so Hal can't take it in the future. If you had looked back, if you look back 3 years ago, in September 2006, and I told you that anything short of an asteroid hitting the Earth could push us to the edge of another Great Depression, you would have rightly dismissed me as some kind of kook. And of course, there were kooks saying that at the time. That's one of the things. You can always go back and find somebody who predicted disaster, the kind of people who predict disaster 3 times a week, hoping that just once they'll finally be right. If you went back 2 years ago at this time, so that's in September 2007, you would have said, well, things look a little shaky, but the odds of repeating the Great Depression seem somewhere around 0. We seem to have a bit of a housing bubble bursting, but as Hank Paulson, who was then the Treasury Secretary, and Ben Bernanke, who was then the Fed chairman, told us, in language they chose deliberately, this housing thing was going to be contained, by which they meant it would be bad for people who owned houses, most of us, and it might be bad for people who lent money to people who owned houses, which is most of the banks. But there was enough other good stuff going on in the economy that it wouldn't be much of a body blow to the economy. After all, at the time, if you may remember, oil prices were going up, and oil prices are kind of an indicator that somebody must be buying. Somebody must have a need for energy, and that suggests a growing economy. So we assumed that somehow the Chinese would grow and it would cushion the blow of this housing thing. Or businesses would somehow keep investing outside of housing, and that would help support us. And so in August 2007, there were some signs that this might be a little bit of an over-optimistic forecast. There were some signs that the housing virus is passing into the banking system, but it didn't seem like anything that ordinary economic policy would be unable to handle. You know, we set up the Federal Reserve to provide a little bit more credit to the economy, to be a lender of last resort when banks are a little short of cash. And so they turned the spigot a little bit there in 2007, and they thought, well, maybe this will work out all right. Now, if you go back just 1 year from now, in the end of September 2008, you would have discovered a nation that really was, in my opinion, and the opinion of people who were trying to steer the economy, on the edge of repeating the Great Depression. Something that seemed perhaps the most remote possibility to economists seemed to be at hand. Not a certainty, of course, but it was frighteningly close. When we surveyed economists at the Wall Street Journal, we asked them, what are the odds of repeating the Great Depression? We're talking about unemployment of 25% or so. People were telling us a 30% chance or a 35% chance. Well, that's pretty big when before you thought it was 0. So in a sense, what I wrote about in this book is how did we go from the period of time when a recession seemed possible but unlikely to one where a depression seemed a substantial risk? And then how do we find ourselves today, just a year later, in an economy which is far from healthy, but at least appears to be growing a little bit? Excuse me, if you take the metaphor of the patient had a heart attack, out of intensive care, not healthy yet, but doing a lot better than we thought the economy would be doing just 6 months ago. Now, I think there are a number of things we've learned. We're learning a lot as we go along here. And one of them is how ill-prepared the U.S. government was to fight a financial panic like the one we just went through. You know, the President of the United States, were we attacked by missiles from Iran or North Korea or wherever, has the power to push a button or make a phone call or whatever he does, send a BlackBerry, I don't actually know how it works, go on Google search and say strike back, and fire missiles back. But the President of the United States does not have the money, Congress has not given him the money or the power to deal with something like we just went through. It was in our system only the Federal Reserve that had that authority. This old institution created after the panic of 1907, which was a panic that has many similarities to this one, but at the time there was no central bank. It was a panic at which the system was saved by one man, J.P. Morgan, who literally sat in his study and decided that which bank would be saved, which would be the Bear Stearns or the AIG of his time, in order to stop the panic. And he called that banker in, and the banker brought securities to his office, and he went through them one at a time until he felt he had enough collateral to make a loan. And it was after that period, with a great deal of political controversy and tension between farmers and industrialists, urban and rural interests, lenders and borrowers, that the Congress and Woodrow Wilson created the Federal Reserve precisely to deal with a panic like the one we have just been through. It was a role for the Fed that's kind of been forgotten. We think, if we think at all about the Fed, about an institution that just moves interest rates. So one of the reasons I set out to do this book is I thought that two things. One, that the Fed was way undercovered by the press, given its power in our society. I mean, we send 1,000, 2,000 reporters to political conventions where nothing happens. It's just like theater. And you could count on the fingers of both your hands the number of reporters in Washington who actually cover the Fed as a full-time beat. And as Hal said, I thought that Bear Stearns was the most remarkable thing that would ever happen to a reporter my age who was covering the Federal Reserve. And so it couldn't get any better than this, which, as I said, tells you a lot about my foresight. And the reason Bear Stearns was interesting was it was the first time since the Depression that the Fed had pulled the emergency cord and said, we're going to use our power given to us by Congress to lend to almost anybody in circumstances we deem, nobody has to approve this, we at the Fed deem to be unusual and exigent. Great words in the law which are nowhere defined. They are whatever the Fed says they are. They may, and they lent money to Bear Stearns. They actually bought assets from Bear Stearns to subsidize its purchase by J.P. Morgan, even though Bear Stearns was an institution the Fed had no responsibility for. And they did it because Bernanke, the chairman, one of Hal's students a long time ago, realized that this was a moment where, had Bear Stearns gone down, the ramifications would have been enormous, and not just to people who had invested or lent money to Bear Stearns. So, although this is very much not a story of one man, it is a story of a surprisingly small number of people who were called on to be first responders to this financial panic. And the star of my story is Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Now, Ben Bernanke was a nice Jewish boy from Dillon, South Carolina, notoriously smart, the kind of kid whose SAT scores were widely known because they were so high, a champion speller who actually made it to the national championships in spelling in Washington, but lost on the spelling of the word Edelweiss. There were no movie theaters in Dillon, South Carolina, so Ben Bernanke had never seen the movie Sound of Music, where the flower, Edelweiss, is one of the star attractions. And he was probably going to go either to the University of South Carolina, the state where he grew up, or the University of North Carolina, the university where his parents had gone to college, but for the intervention of one guy. And it is, I think, one of those truly only in America stories. There was a man in Dillon, South Carolina named Kenneth Manning, an African-American 8 years older than Ben Bernanke, who had been plucked out of a lousy, segregated high school by the United Presbyterian Church, which was trying to help talented black kids in lousy high schools in the South get ahead, and taken eventually to Harvard. And Ken Manning, who later turned out to be a professor of the history of science at MIT, thought that Ben Bernanke was was the kind of person who would benefit from a place like Harvard, and he shouldn't be going to the University of North Carolina, as good a school as it was. And he went to Bernanke and talked him into this, and then he went to Bernanke's parents, and Bernanke's parents thought this was a terrible idea. And his mother came up with a lot of reasons why Bernanke shouldn't have gone to Harvard. And one of them was that she was afraid that Bernanke would lose his Jewish identity. And Ken Manning, this African-American, assured Ben Bernanke's mother that there were Jews at Harvard as well. And in fact, making good on his promise to Mrs. Bernanke, he took young Ben Bernanke to High Holy Day services his first year at Harvard. And Bernanke told me later that one of his mother's frustrations was this African-American man from Dillon, South Carolina, found the services more meaningful than Ben Bernanke did himself. So he goes to Harvard, excels as a student of economics, goes to MIT and gets a PhD in economics, and along the way gets fascinated by Milton Friedman's book on the Great Depression. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz famously wrote a book that said that the problem in the Depression was the Fed was too stingy with credit. Bernanke was taken with the thesis and their methodology and elaborated on it. Friedman and Schwartz thought the Fed was too stingy with credit, so the economy didn't do well, and banks failed because there wasn't enough credit. And that was a symptom, not a cause. Bernanke thought that the bank failure was also a cause of the problem. And so he wrote a lot about how it was that the banks failing made the Great Depression even worse than it would have been otherwise. Now, this is kind of the economic equivalent of being a paleontologist. You study all these dinosaur bones, it's very interesting, and it is totally irrelevant. Except one day, you're standing in San Francisco, and on the Berkeley Hills, you see a Tyrannosaurus Rex on the horizon. And you're one of the few people that knows what the hell these things eat and how to fight them. And so Bernanke was accused at the beginning of this crisis of seeing the world through this lens of the Great Depression and overreacting. That's what people thought about Bear Stearns. They thought he had overreacted. He should have let Bear Stearns go because banks should fail. And that's the way capitalism works. But he saw it through the lens of the Depression, and later, I think he's been proven right. And so by this incredible, really accident of history, a coincidence, we have this guy who had been thinking about the problems that we have just been through in historical context in ways that most other economists thought were largely irrelevant. So Bernanke becomes chairman of the Federal Reserve at the beginning of 2006. George Bush swears him in at the Federal Reserve building and declares that his predecessor, Alan Greenspan, was a rock star, and Bernanke is succeeding a rock star, which was definitely true at the time and tells you a little bit about how fleeting one's reputation should be. So one grain of salt here is that I think Bernanke did a pretty good job. It's pretty close to being a hero of my story, but we'll see in 3 years whether he goes the way of Greenspan. So that's the trouble with writing a book in real time. You may prejudge the verdict of history. Bernanke came to office promising to follow the policies of Alan Greenspan. He was not going to change the direction of the Fed. Greenspan's policies, after all, had been reasonably successful. We had a long period of low inflation and relatively low unemployment. We had an economy which had been extraordinarily resilient. Think of all the things in the 90s that we went through in the early 2000s that didn't really do much harm to the economy. We had the tech stock bubble. It hurt out here, I know, but the rest of the economy recovered pretty quickly. We had a couple of wars in Iraq, spikes in oil prices, even 9/11, which seemed the biggest shock of my lifetime, and even that didn't do much more than a hiccup in the economy. So he had every reason to believe that Greenspan had the magic formula and he was going to continue it. His difference with Greenspan was going to be one largely of style. Greenspan's Federal Reserve was something like the Vatican. He was the Pope, he was infallible, and you don't know anybody else's names. And Bernanke thought this is not a good way in a democracy to run a central bank. And so he set out to elevate the institution above the individuals, the committee of policymakers above the chairman, and to say that he was going to be so open about the way that the Fed thought and what they were doing that when he gave a speech, there would be no new information in it and markets wouldn't move. And for his first year as Fed chairman, he kind of pursued this thing. He didn't try and outshout the other members of the committee. He worked very hard to get consensus. It was not an autocratic central bank. And then about the beginning of 2008, Bernanke realized that when things get bad, there's a reason that committees have a chairman. And that it was confusing to the world to have a dozen Fed officials talking out there, and you needed the Wall Street Journal to tell you which two mattered and which 10 to ignore. And so he began to speak more loudly, to dominate the committee. He moved very rapidly in January 2008, recognizing that he was behind the curve, to cut interest rates by 1.5 percentage points in a period of weeks, which is something that the Fed doesn't usually do. And now we see he's gone well beyond what Greenspan ever did. Seeing the Fed under attack, people suspicious of the Fed, he's gone on 60 Minutes. He's gone on PBS's Jim Lehrer show to take questions from people. He's gone on to the National Press Club and taken questions from reporters. He went to Morehouse College and took questions from economics students and answered them on national TV, because he has recognized that he now has to defend the Federal Reserve, and people do want to know, why did you do what you did? And were you trying to save Wall Street, or were you trying to save me? And so he has become, even more than Greenspan, associated with the Federal Reserve, one man. And along the way, it looks like it was a pretty successful, subtle campaign for re-election, which he, of course, won. Obama has appointed into a second 4-year term. All right, so Bear Stearns comes along. They spend $30 billion of our money, buy this crap off the balance sheet of Bear Stearns that J.P. Morgan Chase doesn't want to hold. And life goes on. And I think there we see, in the 6 months that followed, their failure. Paulson, Bernanke, Geithner, the chairman, now the president of the New York Fed, now the Secretary of Treasury, they did not use that time to figure out how they were going to deal with this if it happened again. They didn't go to Congress and ask for money or power. They say if they'd gone, they would have been shot down, and that was worse than not asking at all, maybe. But also internally, they didn't come up with any plan. How can we create a set of options for ourselves so that if we're confronted with something like Bear Stearns again, we don't have to spend $30 billion in order to bribe somebody else to buy them? So they go into this weekend in the middle of September 2008 unprepared. They have the redwoods on Wall Street shaking. Merrill Lynch is married to Bank of America. They think that's a problem solved. Lehman Brothers, they hope to sell that to a British bank. They rally Wall Street at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York building, a very mighty fortress that's sort of a symbol of financial solid cement, concrete. It's a building built in the 1920s on the replica of a Florentine palace. It is such a model of stability and security that other nations keep their gold in a vault in the basement of the Federal Reserve on the bedrock of Manhattan. And they did not take out their gold even after 9/11. It was a symbol of everything that we believed about our economy. Maybe we don't make things as well as the Japanese. Maybe we don't make them as cheaply as the Chinese or the Indians or the Mexicans. But the one thing America knew how to do was run a financial system. Not. So they bring these guys together on Wall Street, and they basically tell them, Lehman Brothers needs your help. They get the guys to pitch in some money. The government's willing to put some money in, too. If only they can sell this bank to Barclays, the British bank. The British regulators wisely decide not to let it happen, and they have no plan B. They let Lehman Brothers go bankrupt. They say that they expect people to be upset, but not too bad. After all, everybody knew Lehman was in trouble. To some extent, they've been beaten up for saving Bear Stearns, and they talk about it's time to teach Wall Street a lesson, that the government is not going to bail out every big institution. They expect ripples, they get a tsunami. And there are two things, I think, that they didn't appreciate, call it a failure of imagination, if you will, that turned out to be catastrophic. One was, we have these things called money market mutual funds, where people put their money in, expect that the shares will always be worth $1, they get some interest. The money market mutual fund takes their money and buys IOUs from other companies, industrial companies, General Electric, IBM, Caterpillar, places like that. And that's sort of what banks used to do. Now a lot of it goes through money market mutual funds. The Fed and the Treasury thought, well, no money market mutual fund is stupid enough to hold Lehman IOUs, hold Lehman paper. They were wrong. A big one did. It was unable to pay people back $1 for every dollar they put in. It started a run on money market funds, people taking their money out, just the way that we used to have banking runs before we had the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And that's a problem because the industrial economy of America relies on these funds for their financing. So, and I think what will go down in history as one of the more successful rescues, the Fed and Treasury rapidly put together a system to guarantee people's deposits in money market mutual funds so that too many people don't take money out, and find a way to lend directly to companies so that they can keep financing. So while the housing market is going through the floor, we can have the rest of the economy still functioning. And then along comes AIG, and they say, oh my gosh, we can't let another one go. That'll be catastrophic. And they find a way to save them. And then they're stuck with this very awkward thing. They told us, for the record, they couldn't bail out Lehman Brothers because Lehman Brothers didn't have enough collateral to make a loan. The Federal Reserve law says they have to have collateral, they have to have a security, just the way you pledge your house when you get a mortgage. Lehman Brothers didn't have enough to save them, so they let them go down. And that story becomes the story that they now stick with. They don't talk about they were trying to teach Wall Street a lesson. It was all the law. But they have kind of this awkwardness of, so one day in this whole crisis, we decided we couldn't stretch the law. Every other day we managed to stretch it, but this one day we couldn't stretch the law. It's kind of awkward. We surveyed economists on Wall Street a couple of weeks ago at the Wall Street Journal, and about 36 economists, and we asked them, do you believe the story that Bernanke, Paulson, and Geithner didn't have the legal power to save Lehman Brothers? 3-1, they said they didn't believe it. Basically, most people think if there had been a will to save Lehman, there was a way. There wasn't the will, they didn't do it, and the rest has become history, as they say. So not only was there this money market fund problem, but this decision to let Lehman Brothers go stunned the rest of the world. And a European central banker I know said to me a few weeks later, in my country, we don't let dry cleaners fail. It never occurred to us that the United States government would let Lehman Brothers fall. So suddenly you breathe this enormous distrust among financial institutions. They're unwilling to lend even to each other, let alone to you and me. And that is the condition that Bernanke recognized as risking a repeat of the Great Depression. It was, if you'll forgive the medical metaphor, the patient was on the table, and the surgeons were looking at it one organ at a time. There was Merrill Lynch, there was Lehman Brothers, there was AIG, and suddenly the blood stopped circulating. Credit is the lifeblood of the economy. It stopped circulating. There were all these banks that were collapsing and blocking the blood from flowing. I'll stop the metaphor there. You don't have to worry. And so Bernanke set out basically to say, I'm going to do whatever it takes to prevent a repeat of the Great Depression. I am not going to let big financial institutions go down one after another. He and Paulson, of course, go to Congress, get $700 billion, and begin the process of trying to rebuild the financial foundations of our banking system. And I think that we can now look back and say that they did a lot of things. Some of them worked and some of them didn't, but they were not constrained by the orthodoxy of the time, of their advisors. They did whatever it took to try and save us, and it's for the bottom line verdict, you have to say it worked. Things are a lot better today than they would have been 6 months ago, when you would have thought 6 months ago. All right, so I think that raises one interesting question. If Ben Bernanke is so smart, why the heck didn't he see this coming? And I think that's a good question, and I suspect it's one that he has done a lot of thinking about, and I've done some talking to him about it. One thing I think we know is that the Fed kept interest rates too low, too long earlier in this decade, and that produced an orgy of speculation and borrowing. And that was Greenspan's decision, but Bernanke was there helping to lay the intellectual foundation for keeping interest rates low to prevent us from having deflation like they had in Japan. The second thing was that Bernanke told us at the time that the Fed should not raise interest rates if it saw a bubble in the financial markets, that was kind of messy and foolish and you might not get it right. And Greenspan agreed with that, so he didn't do that. But Bernanke said that at times when you think there's just a bit too much borrowing and lending going on, it's important to use the regulatory power of the central government, of the Fed, and he didn't do anything to see that happen. So the Greenspan period is one in which the Fed does not use even the powers it's been given by Congress to deal with mortgage lending. And then the third thing, and the one I think is most interesting and most serious, is that Greenspan sponsored a view in Washington, one that Bernanke didn't visibly object to, which was basically markets generally do a pretty good job, and financial markets do a very good job, and there's a lot of sophisticated investors in these markets, and they have a lot of money at risk, and they're more likely to police the poker table than any bureaucrat or regulator. So the best thing we can do is let them do their stuff because it's in their self-interest to make sure the system is stable. Well, as Greenspan confessed in a hearing before Henry Waxman's committee, that worldview was wrong. And as a result, the poker table tipped over, and it nearly took all of us with it. And that I think, is the biggest sin of the Greenspan era, and one for which Bernanke was present. Now, he's tried to redress that. The Fed has passed some rules to make sure that nobody's making mortgages today that nobody wants to make in the first place. They've done a great job of closing the barn door after the horses have fled. But I think that the question going forward is whether they've learned enough lessons to help come up with some way to manage modern democratic financial capitalism in a way that we get the benefits of all this financial innovation without having to go for a ride that takes the economy off the cliff. So let me stop with where we are now, and then we can go in any number of directions depending on what your questions are. So Bernanke, how's he doing? Well, he got himself reappointed, which is, I think, something that makes him quite proud, that a Democratic president who had other options chose to replace a central banker who was appointed by a Republican. It's a kind of a reward for having done a reasonably good job under fire. I think Obama reappointed him for a couple of reasons. One is that it was not convenient to change drivers at a time when the road is still so bumpy and windy. And secondly, Obama's trying to declare victory against the recession. And it's a little hard to declare victory and then fire the general. Second thing he has to do is figure out, okay, I opened the spigot, I put all this money into the economy. Now, it's a lot of money. When Ben Bernanke became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 2006, the Fed had $800 billion of loans and securities on its books. Today, they have $2 trillion worth. And they did that without any okay of Congress or the President or the Secretary of Treasury. They did that under the power the law gives them, all on their own. And Bernanke has to decide, when do I take that back? When do I raise interest rates? When do I pull some of this credit out? Do it too soon, we get another recession. Do it too late, and he gets more inflation than he thinks is welcome. It takes a great deal of luck and technical skill. But it also, and I think this is his third challenge, takes an enormous amount of political fortitude. Because one thing that has happened in this crisis is the Fed has exposed how much power it actually has. It exposes itself as almost as a fourth branch of government. The ability to create all this money and decide which institutions live and which ones die. And that has created a great deal of suspicion of the Fed. Some of this is deeply rooted in American history. There was a fight between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson over whether we ought to have a central bank. Hamilton said yes, Jefferson said no. There has always been a great deal of suspicion in the United States about concentrated financial power, even when it's kind of half in the government, the way the Fed is. And the second thing is that this has angered people, this episode. People in America think Wall Street got bailed out, and they didn't. So Ben Bernanke went on 60 Minutes to tell people, I didn't want to bail out Wall Street. I wanted to bail out Main Street, but the only way to bail out Main Street was to bail out Wall Street. It's kind of a hard argument to make. Or as Barney Frank, who's the wonderfully clever chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, who is the source of almost all great one-liners on everything economics, said at a hearing the other day, said the problem we have here is that it's really hard for a politician to get reelected with a bumper sticker that says, it could have been worse. And that's basically where we are right now. Ben Bernanke, in my book, is a hero because it could have been worse. It's just kind of hard to convince people of that. Thank you very much. There's one right behind you. Good, please.
So as you rightly said, that one of the criticisms of the Greenspan Fed was keeping interest rates low for so long. And perhaps Bernanke Fed is making the same mistake, or perhaps not, we don't know, in hindsight. Do you ever see a Fed chairman like, Volcker coming back, who's much more aggressive on pricking bubbles in their infancy?
Well, I don't think Volcker is a good example of someone who pricks a bubble. Paul Volcker, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 1980s, early 1980s, took over at a time when we had very high inflation in the United States. And he had the guts to say, I'm going to raise interest rates so high that the economy will go into such a deep recession that there's no way that we can have inflation. And I think he set an example for central bankers. And both Greenspan and Bernanke have benefited by the view that, as painful as that was probably the right thing, and we have a stronger economy as a result. So Bernanke says he's determined not to let inflation get out of hand. Now, to be sure, inflation is not a problem now. It's really hard to get a good inflation going when you have 10% unemployment and more unused capacity in American factories than we've had in decades. The question is whether he has created so much money that he won't pull it out of the system in time to avoid the inflation. I can tell you that he says he will, and I believe that he intends to. But will he be able to do it or not is not a question I can answer. And the people who look at history, and the wonderful thing about economics is you can find an historical example for any case you want to make. The people who look at history say that when countries get into trouble and they borrow lots of money, they tend to end up creating inflation to get out of it because it's easier to pay back your debts with cheaper dollars. But I don't know that, and that's true. That's definitely a fact. But I don't know whether, and if you say the opposite and you say, well, this is different. This is the United States of America, and things are weirder here. We have dollars that no one else, we have a currency that no one else can match. And we have all sorts of things. So you say, well, this time is going to be different. And then cynical reporters like me to say, I've heard that before. It's always going to be different. So is it a risk? Yes. Do I know what's going to happen? No. Sir.
So you said that Greenspan's greatest sin was his sort of faith in the free market, right? But I think it's not really very controversial to say that his greatest sin was the low interest rates.
Right. I think that, well, they're related. Look, here, let me give you an answer this way. I think it's very easy to say in hindsight that the Fed kept interest rates too low too long. But that was only obvious in hindsight. Where were we when he was doing this? We were, he thought, and Bernanke thought, at risk of having something like Japan, where you have this deflation where prices fall and people don't spend and you end up in a kind of a downward spiral. And their reading of the economy and of economics was that at times like that, you cut interest rates low and you let them stay low until the economy gets going again. And it wasn't so obvious at the time that that was the wrong decision. I think the question about relying on the self-interest of markets to regulate themselves was more evident at the time that that was a mistake. There was one big mistake, which was people thought that if you, and Greenspan had a very good way of talking about this, if you made a lot of loans and turned them into securities and sold those securities to other people, you spread the risks throughout the system. And that would make for a more stable economy. His metaphor was it was like the electronics on an airplane. And if on a sophisticated airplane, the electronics are always adjusting so the ride could be smoother. The financial system was these electronics, and it was absorbing a lot of the volatility in the economy so the airplane could fly more smoothly. That was widely held. It turned out to be wrong. But the second thing, and this is where there were lots of objections, was this view that when in doubt, don't regulate. And that was something that was challenged at the time, but he had so much intellectual clout. He had so convinced people that he knew what more than they did, that they listened to him. And he was part of a groupthink in Washington that led that basically we'll have a better economy the fewer financial regulations we have. And so the reason I say that I think that was the bigger sin was because I think that was more evident at the time. Interest rates being too low for too long is only really clear to me in hindsight.
Another question, if I may?
Sure.
Yeah, so we therefore created basically, or continue to create moral hazard, right? And so instead of asking ourselves, how do we convince basically these people to say, okay, take our money to bail out these players in the financial system when they fail, shouldn't we be asking, why don't they have the incentive? Why doesn't it come back to them?
Yes,
What's
absolutely.
wrong with the system? And aren't a lot of the things that Bernanke and Greenspan did, aren't they perpetuating the moral hazard?
Yes. So there are two parts to what you said. One is, there's one easy part and one hard part. The easy part is, okay, so it should have been obvious, and now we know. If you tell people, if you make a mortgage to somebody, and then you take that mortgage and sell it to somebody else, and if the homeowner doesn't pay the loan, somebody else gets stuck with the losses, that you don't have much incentive to be very careful about who you lend to. Even less incentive if you're making a lot of money by moving these mortgages. So that business will probably come to an end now. And there are proposals, which the administration and the Fed is in favor of, which says that if you make a mortgage to somebody, you got to hold a piece of it. So if they don't pay back the mortgage, you're on the hook too, not just the poor schnook who bought the loan. So that's the easy part. We had a system that...
But then that doesn't eliminate the poor schnooks buying those loans, though. Shouldn't they watch out, too?
Yes, they should, right? But that's one of the things that's kind of frustrating about this. There were sophisticated people. The people at Bear Stearns had a lot of money in their company, yet they did things that were risky. But I think the bigger moral hazard question is one that you alluded to. Moral hazard means that if you give somebody insurance and say, if you do something stupid, we'll cover your losses, you kind of don't have much reason to be careful. And so we have set up a situation where if you lend money to a big financial institution on Wall Street, if it's big enough, you can be sure that as a result of this crisis, the Fed and the Treasury will make you whole if they go under, which will lead you to lend them more money at cheaper rates than is wise, and will create an incentive for them to take bigger risks and put us through this ringer again. And that is a huge problem that they're wrestling with now in Washington how to solve. It's often called the too big to fail problem. Now, one answer, George Shultz, who's now at Stanford, says, too big to fail means you're too big, and that we ought not to have so many big institutions. The current thinking at the Fed and the Treasury is that that's just not possible, that there are advantages to scale, and there are particularly lots of big banks around the world. We have a list in the Wall Street Journal today of the 10 biggest banks, and 2 of them are American. 8 are foreign. So if we bust up those 2, we still have a lot of big foreign banks, and they could do the same thing to us that Lehman Brothers just did to us. So they're wrestling with ways in which you create fewer incentives to get big, and you basically tax them if they're relying on this government insurance. So if you read the stories that are coming out of the G20 meeting in Pittsburgh this week, you'll see that Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, is on a kind of campaign to get banks to hold more capital. What that means is that these big institutions, if they're putting the whole system at risk, should be forced to have bigger capital cushions, so if they have losses, they can absorb more of the losses themselves. The bigger the capital cushion, the less leverage they have, the less borrowing do, the less profitable they will be. And so they're trying to set up a system where if you are too big to fail, you have to pay some penalty and take some safeguards in order to make it less likely that it will run through this thing. But it's very difficult because no matter what the Treasury, the Fed, and the President say, no one's going to believe them when they say we're not going to save a big financial institution. We just proved that. If things are bad enough, we'll save them.
And you can't really legislate success, right? You
cannot legislate success.
So can you talk a little bit about where the AIG money went?
Let's bracket that. Let some other people, and if we run out of questions, I'll answer that one.
Yeah, sort of a segue from the moral hazard question. Some of these CDOs, they were actually, people didn't think they were taking risks because they were all rated as good as U.S. Treasuries by the rating agencies. And there were at least some recent reports that I saw that there might be some corruption involved in the sense that they actually gave good ratings because they thought they wouldn't get more business if they gave bad ratings to these things. So, I mean, how does the regulatory agencies, the laws, and Fed actually?
It's a good question. All right. So one of the things that's the most upsetting about this whole episode is how many institutions and checks on the financial system failed here. I mean, just think of the litany. So there were these bank risk management committees that didn't know the risks that their banks were taking. There were the credit rating agencies, as you say, which certified things as being AAA. That was supposed to mean that there was very little chance of default, which proved to be wrong. They had an incentive, you're right. They were paid by issuers, and that seems like somewhat of a corrupt system. There were the people who made the mortgages that we talked about earlier. They were the people who took the mortgages, hoping that they would never have to worry, because if house prices go up, you can always refinance. And there was the regulators that were kind of blind to the fact that looking at banks one at a time didn't tell you about how much problems at Bank A could affect Bank C, D, and E, and how the problems at Bank E could affect F, G, and H. And so they didn't look at the things systemically. And I think there was also, to be quite candid, a failure on our part in the press that we didn't listen enough to the people who were trying to point this out. And when we did write about problems, we didn't do it in a way that had an impact, and that's a failure on our part. So, but one of the things that And we're now addressing those serially. And people should be more skeptical about rating agencies, and I think they will be in the future. The government did things to set up the rating agencies as authorities, and the government is now going to undo that. But there is part of the thing that you said, which reminds you that this is kind of an unusual event, and people do not get prepared for very, very improbable, unusual events. People got mortgages. These mortgages were put into a pool. They sliced them into 10 pieces. And they said that the first piece, you got hit by the first people who don't pay their mortgages. If there's not enough money there, then the second piece will get hit all the way through to the 10th piece. And the 10th piece looked relatively safe. It probably wasn't AAA, but there was good reason to believe it was safe. After all, there were 9 other slices that were going to have to get whacked before you did. But housing prices fell so much that the 10th piece got whacked. And there, I think, is where we learned just how much of our financial system was built on the jello of an assumption that housing prices would never fall across the board in the United States. And that really was a failure of imagination. People just did not think that could happen. They were taking greater risks than they realized, and we're paying the price now.
Yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts around just kind of the government's decision to let Lehman fail, and if it was based on kind of Paulson's overplaying his hand that the government wouldn't backstop a deal with, say, Barclays and whatnot. And then the ultimate kind of hypocrisy, if not, the way that it looks in terms of conflicts of interest, having him being the former, president and CEO of Goldman Sachs and backing up AIG and the whole, relationship there. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So it's a good question, and you hear that a lot. Just so people understand where this is coming from. So Paulson is the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and he's the Treasury Secretary. And there's a long history of people going from Goldman Sachs to positions in Washington. We sometimes call them government Sachs for that reason. And it is clear that Paulson is kind of an impulsive guy who has a visceral dislike for both the people at Bear Stearns and the people at Lehman Brothers, and realizes like, oh my gosh, this could really be bad. Goldman Sachs could be next, and that helps motivate him. So I think in terms if you're asking me, did that have any influence on him? The answer is yes. Are you asking me, was Hank Paulson a card-carrying member of the Wall Street establishment who believed that investment banks do more good than harm? The answer to that is yes. But where I think people are just a little too conspiratorial to me is that he was doing all this because it was going to line his own pocket or take care of Goldman Sachs. And I honestly don't believe that's the case. I know it doesn't sound like the cynical reporter, but I don't think that's fair to him. I think he really was trying to save the system. But there is a big question about Goldman Sachs, which basically goes like this. They always seem to be on the winning side of this thing. So are they smart or do they cheat? And honest to God, I don't know the answer. And it's one of the reasons I'm hoping that this commission that was set up, that Phil Angelides chairs, the Treasurer of California, will make that one of their questions. Because it would be good to learn, if they were so smart, what we can learn from that. And they are pretty good at managing risks. But if they are taking advantage of their strength in order to do end runs or getting inside information from the government about what the government's going to do, then that's obviously not fair and something needs to be done about it. I think the decision on Lehman, I think it's a muddle. We're never going to really know what motivated them. I think that, and they've changed their story over time. As I say, they now built it all on this legal thing. But I think that they would have preferred to sell it to Barclays. I think Paulson was trying to do the tough guy thing to Wall Street. And one of Paulson's failures, I think, is that he was a deal maker. So he would say things in the process of making a deal that, when the deal's done, it doesn't really matter that I kind of exaggerated. But when you're running a government policy, people tend to believe what you say. And they kind of think that you're enunciating a principle that will apply tomorrow, the day after that. So he says things, I am not going to buy stock on the banks. We're only going to use this $700 billion to buy assets. And then Congress has barely passed the law, and he says, we got to buy stock on the banks. And then he says, why are people so confused? And I've talked to him about this. He honestly thinks that if he stood here before you and he's writing a book, we'll see if he can pull it off. If he could explain to you all the things that were going through his mind when he said something that was not true, you would be sympathetic and understand that it's okay that he didn't say what he was really thinking. And my line to that is, well, what you say, it's what people hear that matters. And people heard you say one thing and not another. They're confused, and so it makes them suspicious of everything else.
It was my understanding that one of the reasons for the past crisis was that the banks were over-leveraged.
Correct.
That they essentially lent money to each other, borrowed from each other, the money that they kind of printed themselves, that were not issued by Fed, it was just IOUs. So the question is the economy de-leveraged now? Or we still have more this, funny money circulating in the economy and the second crisis awaits?
Well, I hope the second crisis doesn't await, but there's always a possibility. Look, it is true that the banking system and the whole U.S. economy was leveraged to a degree that now seems imprudent. Leverage meaning that you have $10 worth of capital, you borrow $90 billion worth of capital, and you invest it in something, and then if it goes up, you make a huge return because you have only a little bit of capital invested, but if it goes down, you're out of business. And I don't think it's right to say that was funny money. In fact, the problem was it wasn't so funny. There were people who had lent them that money. And those people were kind of upset when it looked like the money wouldn't get paid back. So if you were a bondholder of Washington Mutual up in Washington State, you didn't get all your money back. Or if you were a preferred shareholder of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored mortgage entities, you didn't get all your money back. So it was not funny money. Now, the question is, we have too much leverage. We are in the process of as they say, deleveraging. And what that means is people are going to have to live a little bit more closer to within their means. And what we see, if you look at the data, what you see is businesses, both financial and non-financial, and households in particular, are paying back their debt. They're saving more. And the government has compensated by that by borrowing tons. And this makes a lot of sense because if everybody tried to pay down their debts all at once and stop spending money, we'd have an even worse recession than we have now. The question is, will the government be able to restrain its borrowing and pay that back, or are we going to end up with some other kind of bubble that comes from having too much government debt and have borrowed too much? Is that responsive? Not really, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, essentially the question was if the economists have a formula that can tell them if the system is over-leveraged.
The answer is no.
Okay.
And if they did, you shouldn't believe it. Are there any questions from online you want to ask?
Sure. I think we might have touched on this briefly, but a popular question was, why does the Fed continue to allow Goldman access to its discount window and other credit facilities at such low rates? They're clearly very profitable and already rarely act as a lender, especially for small to mid-sized businesses.
Right. All right. So what happened in this crisis was that there were things that were banks that the Fed lent to traditionally, and there were things that were not banks that the Fed lent to untraditionally. And then things that were not banks, magic formula, they call themselves banks, and now they can borrow from the Fed, and Goldman is one of them. I suspect that Goldman is actually not borrowing very much from the Fed right now. It's one of these things where it's kind of like in order to save the system, you have to save the banks on Wall Street. And as I said, as Bernanke said, you have to save Wall Street in order to save Main Street. And if you save Wall Street, people who are big players on Wall Street are going to get bailed out. And the question about AIG earlier is related to that. Because why did they have to save AIG? Why did they decide they had to save AIG? Because AIG had deals with almost everybody in the world. And they were afraid that if AIG went under in a messy way, the same way Lehman had gone under in a messy way, that the system would stop functioning. So they paid off all of AIG's creditors at 100 cents on the dollar. And among those creditors was Goldman Sachs and a lot of other banks, a lot of them overseas. And that leads people to say, like, well, what kind of a game is this, right? You work for Chrysler and your contract is shredded because the company goes bankrupt and you have to take lower wages or less health care, but you're smart enough to make bets with some big financial institution that the federal government has determined is unable to let go, and you get paid off 100 cents on the dollar. And there's a lot of logic to that thing. So one of the things that's going on now, one of the things that I find most frustrating as a citizen is that Bernanke and Obama and Geithner have gone to Congress and said, we don't want to be in this position again. If there's another Lehman or AIG that goes, we want to have a choice between bankruptcy, which we think is too messy and too dangerous, and bailout, which you don't like. So give us some third way, the same way that the FDIC can go in and take care of a failing bank. Let us decide who gets paid back and who doesn't get paid back. Let us do the sort of rough justice thing. And Congress has refused to give them that power. Not because they're against it, because Congress can't seem to get anything done these days. And so one of the things that's most frightening is that Bernanke and Geithner and Obama have no more authority to deal with a crisis like Lehman Brothers today than they had a year ago when it happened. And I think that's irresponsible. So let's see. I see a couple people leave. Why don't we take a couple more questions, and I'm happy to... are there more online you want to do? Okay.
Okay, this is another popular one. Does the Fed now believe it's responsible to pop bubbles? If so, how does it intend to trade that off with other two responsibilities to keep inflation down and the economy stable? Serving three masters is harder than serving two.
Yeah, but life's hard, right? So it's a really good question. So the conventional wisdom was that the Fed should not pop bubbles. What that means is that if the Fed's sitting around, like you and me might sit around, we could all agree that stock prices have gone up too far, housing prices have gone up too far. The conventional wisdom is the Fed should not raise interest rates to try and bring down those prices of those assets. And the thinking was that, well, first of all, you might be popping a bubble that's not really a bubble. You only know after the fact if it's a bubble. And you might actually do more harm than good by popping a bubble. And our job is to clean up the mess after the bubble bursts. And this theory got a great test during the tech stock bubble, where they did very little. You may remember Greenspan made that famous speech about irrational exuberance, which everybody pretty much ignored. And then the bubble burst, and they did things, lowered interest rates to keep the economy moving. We had a recession, but it was a weak one. And so there was a lot of applause among the economists that this was the right view. And Bernanke was a subscriber to that view. But if you ask Bernanke now what he thinks, he says, we have to rethink that thing. Because we have just seen how much damage can be done to an economy. I mean, this is the worst recession we've had since the Great Depression itself. We have seen how much damage can be done by to an economy when the bubble bursts. So I think there is this kind of shakes up a lot of the intellectual underpinnings that influenced monetary policy in the past, and they are in the process of rethinking this. And I think that, at least for the near term, they will give more thought to whether they should prick an asset bubble if they see one happening because of this.
Should institutions that are too big to fail be allowed to exist?
Right. Well, I think I answered that. The answer is probably not, but we haven't found a way to do without these big institutions. So the question is, how do we build a system that is more insulated against the damage done when one of these big institutions fails?
What new regulations does the Fed want to create to dissipate the moral hazard caused by its support for large banks?
The Fed wants to, A, make these banks hold more capital so they're less profitable. It's kind of a tax on size. Secondly, they promise to be more vigilant in their regulation and supervision, which I'm sure they'll be for a few years until the memories wear thin. And thirdly, you may have seen in the papers the other day, they're talking about ways to tweak the compensation of the big banks to create fewer incentives to take these risks. And I thought one of the most interesting things they were doing is they say they're going to take the 25 banks and they're going to put their compensation plans on the table. And they're going to ask the question, if one of the banks is being more generous or has some kind of weird thing, why are you an outlier? It's kind of like what they do in Major League Sports to try and prevent the banks from having a bidding war for talent. So it's a good thing you're here and not going to business school and going to work in finance. Can we have time for one more? One more. No, let's take this gentleman behind you.
Yeah, so for banks and lenders, increasing capital requirements can kind of help them to be more stable. But for something like AIG, where they sell insurance, right? It's not clear what kind of capital they need. It seems like it's much harder for something like AIG that's buying risk rather than lending money.
AIG is something that should not have been allowed to exist. The problem wasn't their insurance businesses. The problem was this huge portfolio of bets, the casino they were running on the side. And they did not hold enough capital to make good those risks, make those bets. So the answer is, we know pretty much how to regulate insurance companies, and we have guarantee funds when insurance companies fail. But if you're going to be an insurance company, then if you're going to also be in the business of running a financial casino on the side, that you have to have substantial capital to back that up if you're doing this risky trading.
David, thank you very much.
Thank you.